Hey guys, in today's lecture we'll be dealing with the topic of interpretation. Now what is interpretation? We can define interpretation as a setting forth of one or more meanings of a work of literature. So a work of literature, as we all know, has multiple meanings. And if we set forth or put forth multiple meanings or one or more meanings of a particular literary work, then that's known as interpretation. Once again, we can define interpretation as a setting forth of one or more meanings of a work of literature. Although some critics believes that the work of literature has a single meaning, the meaning it had for the author, others believe that a work has multiple meanings. So some critics staunchly believe that there is only one meaning for a particular work, and that single meaning is the meaning that it had for its author. What the author might have felt while he composed the work is of prime importance, and that's the only meaning that you need to consider. That is what some critics says. So you might be familiar with this popular meme, right? On what the English teacher says and what the poet says. So on reading a poem on turtle, an English teacher might say that the turtles are a symbol of the indifferent and selfish society, because turtles often hide back in their shells when they see threat, right? So an English teacher might say that a poem on turtles is a symbol, or in the poem on turtles, the turtles are a symbol of the indifferent and selfish society that we live in. But what the poet might have actually meant might be that I like turtles, that's why I wrote a poem on them. A similar meme is also there on the poem Raven. If you can find it, do find it. So again, a critic might give n number of interpretation to a particular text, but for the author he might have chosen it for his own personal reasons. Another thing is that sometimes you can see certain psychological perspectives too of that of the author that would get reflected in the work which he writes. Okay, so there are some psychological perspectives, or there are some aspects of the author's psyche which gets reflected when he writes a work. This becomes apparent in Russian novels. So in Russian novels you might come across a sentence like this: this winter is harsh and unforgiving. So this winter is a natural element, right? So it's harsh and unforgiving, just like my father. So this is in the first part it was a pathetic fallacy where the person is trying to ascribe personal attributes or emotions to nature. And in the second part he says that the winter is just like my father. My father too was harsh and unforgiving. So here it means that this might be a reflection of the character or the time period in which he lived, or this might be a reflection of the author's psyche. The author might have felt alienated from his father, hence he might have written like this. So these are two ways of looking at the author's intention. Okay. So now what are the other ways in which we can look at a literary work? The other critics, or most of the critics, hold the view that a work has several meanings. For example, the meaning it had for the author, the meaning it had for the first readers or the first audiences of a particular play. The peculiarity of the first readers or the first audiences is that they might be the author's contemporaries. They might have lived at the time in which the author lived, or they might have seen the play as produced or by the dramatist. Now the third way of looking at a work is the meaning it had for the later readers. You know, after that, after the time period of the author, what the play or the piece of work meant for the later readers, and then the meaning it had for us today, and then the meaning that it had for people like us in this day. So these are the multiple ways in which we can look at a literary work. So here the author's intention is not the one scale through which we analyze a literary work. We also analyze the literary work through the meaning it had for the first readers or the first audience of a particular play, and then the meaning it had for the later readers or the later viewers of the play, and the meaning it had for us today. It has for us today. Now let me elucidate this point with the help of an example. Let us take the case of Hamlet. Now Hamlet was a work which was published in the year 1600s. The year of composition roughly spans from 1600s to 1601. Now what it might have meant for the author. So what William Shakespeare might have felt while he wrote Hamlet. Now let's just go to some of the personal biographical details of the author when he wrote Hamlet. So Hamlet is a play about a man who lost his father, right? Prince Hamlet lost his father, the King Hamlet Senior. So at the time of composition of the play Hamlet, Shakespeare had recently lost his father. Okay, so that's one point. So this is a biographical detail. So that is, at the time of composition of Hamlet, Shakespeare had recently lost his father. And the second key factor is that he had lost a son named Hamnet. So notice this variant spelling between Hamlet and Hamnet. Maybe he might have wrote Hamlet keeping in mind his son's name, Hamnet, right? So that's also a possibility. So these are certain biographical details which might have contributed to the composition of the work. Shakespeare might have written about the loss of father because he himself has lost a father. So that's there. Now what the play might have meant to the Shakespeare's audience. Remember what the play might have meant for the first readers or the first audience, which means what it might have meant to Shakespeare's contemporaries. Now, during Shakespeare's time, or for that matter, whenever a work is written, usually it caters to the audience or it caters to the public who lived at that time, to the reading public who lived at that time, or to the viewers who lived at that time. And often in the plays of Shakespeare, we can see that there are a lot of intrigues and stories which are associated with kings, and plots will be there. Gruesome plots will be there. So this play had significance for the 16th century audience as well. Let's take a look at it. In the 16th century, the issue of a man's marriage to his deceased brother's wife was not a morbid preoccupation of a stage character. So if we read Hamlet, we might say that Hamlet is obsessed with his mother marrying his uncle, right? So for the 16th century audience, however, this was not a news, as I said before. This was not a news because such marriages did happen. So in the 16th century, the issue of a man's marriage to his deceased brother's wife was not a morbid preoccupation of a stage character, but an issue which decided the fate of England. It was the occasion of Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and she was previously the Princess of Wales as the wife of Henry's elder brother Arthur. Ooh, the plot grows thicker, right? So what happens here, or what happened here, is that when we analyze Hamlet from the historical setting in which it was written, it was a time in which Henry VIII ruled over the land, and he was going to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife, remember? And he was not just Henry VIII's. Though Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon had previously married King Arthur, who was Henry VIII's brother. So Catherine of Aragon was previously married to Henry VIII's brother, and she was already a princess. And a union was made between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon so that England would expand its lands. So there was a political ploy behind the marriage, and in the end, Henry VIII was a king who had divorces. He had a number of divorces. He married 5 times, and these 5 out of which 4 ladies, either they were beheaded or they died or he divorced them. So Henry VIII was a very notorious king, and when it came to marriage, he married 5 times, 4 of them, and only 1 wife survived, and that too because by the time Henry VIII married the 5th time, he was already weak and fragile, so he died first. That's why she escaped. All the other wives died. So when you consider the history of England at that time, this was the time in which Henry VIII wanted to bring forth a reformation in England as well. He wanted to bring in Protestantism, and he wanted to bring forth reformation in England. And when you view the storyline of Hamlet, you can see that there are certain parallels between what is the political climate in England as well as what is the political between there are parallels between the political climate in England and the political climate in Denmark. Okay, so when Hamlet the senior is introduced in the play, that is when King Hamlet is introduced in the play, he is portrayed as a pagan king. The way in which he dresses himself, he is portrayed as a pagan king, similar to Beowulf's time. And this king is asking for revenge or seeking for revenge. So in Christianity, seeking revenge is not a thing. So Christians don't believe in seeking revenge. They believe in redemption and salvation. So revenge is not a concept that is there inherent in Christianity. Okay. So that shows why Hamlet is shown to be he is shown to have studied in University of Wittenberg, and this University of Wittenberg has parallels to Lutheran, the university, where they followed Christianity. They were staunch followers of Christianity, and in a way it can be said that Hamlet wanted to bring forth a reformation in Denmark. He wanted to free the people of Denmark from pagan beliefs, and his father himself was one such person. That is why Hamlet shows an indecision in killing Claudius. Hamlet shows an indecision in killing Claudius, even though his father has asked or has sought for revenge, because he believes that in Christian belief, revenge is not the ultimate, and you will never seek revenge. Be it a person who killed your father, you must not seek revenge, and that's what is there in Christianity, and he believes in it. Okay, so that's why at first he's not able to believe the ghost of his own father, and he believes that if he believes in a ghost, then that means that he too is pagan. He wanted to reform Denmark in the same way in which Henry VIII might have wanted to reform, wanted to bring in reformation. So is that clear? So in this way you can say that for the audience, for the Elizabethan audience as well as the first audiences of Hamlet, this might have been there at the back of their minds when they saw Hamlet on stage. So all these events might have been there at the back of their minds when they saw the play Hamlet. So the political setting in which the play is written also plays a crucial role in interpreting the text. I hope that it was clear. Now we shall move on to what it might mean to the present day audiences or for the later audiences. So later, Freud came up with his interpretations, right? And he came up with different interpretations on Oedipal complex and how the son feels an attraction towards the mother, and it can only be quelled or it can only be quenched if in the end the son feels that his father is more powerful than him, and that's called castration complex. That he feels that he might be castrated by his father if he has feelings towards his mother. So this Oedipal complex, or the concept of Oedipal complex, was established by Freud, and the later readers might be familiar with Freud and what he said about the play. It is a play about a young man who subconsciously lusts after his mother and seeks to kill his father. So this is like an Oedipal triangle. It is like it is a play which explicitly shows Oedipal complex. Because this is a young man who lusts after his mother and seeks to kill his father. That's why he is unable to take a decision on killing Claudius, because subconsciously he wanted to kill his father and marry his mother. That's why he is indecisive. Many later critics said the same. So for the later audience, this might have been the perspective through which they looked at Hamlet. Now when we look at Hamlet today, it might appear that Hamlet is a play about a largely alienated young man in a bourgeoisie society. So in the character of Polonius and in the character of Claudius and Gertrude, you find bourgeoisies. They are all bourgeoisies in the sense that they want to find mirth in funeral. Even Claudius uses these words. He says that you need to find mirth in funeral. You won't be able to do that, right? Since they belong to a bourgeoisie society, they are easily able to forego the pains. And even Polonius and the long counsels that he gives to Laertes shows that they are bourgeoisies, they are rich people, and they give little importance to ordinary events. So we may see the play as an alienated young man in a bourgeoisie society. So Hamlet is an alienated man. He does not believe in this bourgeoisie settings, or he does not believe in pomp and pompadour, and he wants to live away because he has constant preoccupations with death and the like. He has constant preoccupations with the meaning of life and death and the like, and he does not appear as a materialistic person. Whereas in the case of all the other characters, they do appear as materialists. Say for Ophelia, all the other characters do appear or do come across as materialists. So you can have n number of interpretation for any play. So the interpretation might go on like this. So we have just talked about 4 levels of interpretation. First was looking at the play from the intention of the author. Second was looking at the play from the perspective of the audience to whom the play was addressed. That is the first level of audience. Then looking at the play from the perspective of the later audience, and looking at the play from the perspective of the present day audience. Now moving on to the author's intention. Now it's very crucial for students of literature to look at author's intentions. Shouldn't we be concerned with the intentions of the author, what the author might have felt while he wrote the work? So for the older works, we may never know what the author might have intended. Even though we said that when we take the biographical details of Shakespeare, it was the time in which when he wrote Hamlet, it was the time in which his father died. We may never know what the author's real intention was. So for older works, we may never know what the author's intention is. Can we go back to Beowulf and ask the poet of Beowulf, what was your intention in writing Beowulf? We won't be able to do that, right? In the case of Hamlet, we do not have any statement made by Shakespeare stating his intention concerning the play. He has never written anything on why he wrote the play. It becomes quite apparent that Shakespeare wanted to write a tragedy, because if he had intended to write a comedy, then we must say that this was a horrible comedy, because he had intended to write a tragedy. That is the only intention that we might get out of the play, that Shakespeare intended to write a tragedy while he was writing Hamlet. Other than that, he has not written anything on the play or why he wrote the play, etc. So one might argue that we can deduce Shakespeare's intention from the play itself. Why Shakespeare wrote this play? എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഷേക്സ്പിയർ ഈ പ്ലേ എഴുതിയത്? We might be able to deduce Shakespeare's intention on writing the play. And how can we do that? We can deduce the intentions from the play itself. That is, if we read the play closely, we will be able to reach at why Shakespeare wrote the play. That is, the intention of the author in writing the play will be evident in the text. എന്ന് നമ്മൾ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ we can know his intention by studying the play. We should study the play in the light of Shakespeare's intention, some might say. That is, the first critics might say that, some critics might say that we must study the play in light of Shakespeare's intention. ഷേക്സ്പിയർ എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഈ കഥ എഴുതിയത് എന്നതിൻ്റെ വെളിച്ചത്തിലായിരിക്കണം നമ്മൾ ഈ സ്റ്റോറി പഠിക്കേണ്ടതെന്ന് ക്രിട്ടിക്സ് പറയും. Why Shakespeare wrote this play? We must study the play in the light of Shakespeare's intention. But in order to know Shakespeare's intention, we must closely observe the play itself and deduce why he wrote this play. We can know his intention by studying the play. ഒരു പ്ലേ വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ അത് എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ് എഴുതിയതെന്ന ഇന്റൻഷൻ അതിൽ നിന്ന് വരും എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നതെങ്കിൽ ഇറ്റ് ഗോസ് ഓൺ ഇൻ എ സർക്കിൾ, റൈറ്റ്? ഫോർ എക്സാമ്പിൾ, ഇഫ് യു വാണ്ട് ടു സേ ദാറ്റ് ഷേക്സ്പിയർ റോട്ട് ദ പ്ലേ, he wanted the major character to have Oedipal complex. So in order to say that the major character has Oedipal complex, you need to go back to the play and search the instances where Prince Hamlet is indecisive, is not able to take a decision because of his Oedipal complex. So this goes on in a circle. And we might not be able to reach an argument here because it goes on in a circle. So most of the arguments, so for that matter, whenever you analyze a play through a certain critical lens, it goes on in a circle. You have a particular intention in your mind, that is, you need to find the author's intentions in writing the play, and for finding the author's intention you go back to the text and try to find out places in which the author's intention is revealed, and it goes on like that. It is a circular process. Moving on. Now sometimes the author might record why he wrote the play. This has happened with MT too. MT has written work on how he writes. So sometimes the author has gone record expressing an intention. We may think twice before accepting this statement as decisive, because sometimes authors might write out their intention in writing a particular work. For example, there is an author named Narayan in Malayalam. He writes, he is considered to be the first tribal writer from Kerala, and he wrote many novels like Kochereti and Uralikudi and the like, and he writes about the tribals for that matter, and quite extensively. And recently his memoir came out, and in his memoir he wrote about the difficulties that he faced when he first went for publishing his work. So that is a memoir in which he tries to write about what made him write the play, and he says that certain skewed or distorted kind of representations of the Adivasis, where they were represented as being savages, made him write this particular work so that they will be shown in a better light. That's what Narayan said. Similarly, Thomas Mann, the famous writer, once said that in one of his works, the intention why he wrote the work was that he wanted to enthuse his family members. So why he wrote a particular work was that he wanted to enthuse his family members. So he wrote this in one of his books. And so writers do have ways in which they express the intention of writing a particular work, but you cannot take these intentions too in face value, because the author might be might be speaking all this facetiously. The author may be speaking about these facetiously, that is, he would be just flippantly speaking about it. He might not be sure about it 100%. He might not be familiar why he wrote the work, or what was his intention. He might be speaking deceptively in order to sell his book. He might be speaking in a deceptive manner, because in one instance, Kamala Suraya did say that when she wrote my Endekada, or my story, in certain instances she said that this is not my life, but earlier she had said that these are snippets taken from her life. Then she said that she went on to contradict her statement, and she said that this is not my life. I just said it out of curiosity. That's what she said. So sometimes this might be a deception. Sometimes the author might mistakenly say that this was my intention, when in reality it might not be. And sometimes this might be put forth very unconvincingly. Sometimes an author might boast about certain ways in which he wrote a work, but this might be unconvincing to the readers. So he might say things unconvincingly. So even if a person writes about why he wrote his literary work, what his intentions were when he wrote his literary work, you cannot just buy it. You cannot just swallow it. Okay, you need to be sure that the author is not trying to deceive you, because the author might try to deceive you even when he says that this was my intention in writing the work. Okay, so that do happen. Now, keeping that in mind, what is the characteristic feature of a good interpretation? We shall look at it in the next slide. Characteristics of a good interpretation. Even the most vigorous advocates of the idea that meaning is indeterminate do not believe that all interpretations are equally significant. So, many people say that meaning is indeterminate. Many critics believe that meaning is indeterminate. What do you mean by indeterminate? You cannot determine meaning. Meaning is always indeterminate. So even the vigorous advocates of the idea that meaning is indeterminate, or that meaning is forever transient, or meaning is not fixed or arbitrary, might not believe that all interpretations are equally significant. So they don't believe that all interpretations are equally significant. Even though they say that meaning is arbitrary or meaning cannot be determined, they do not believe that all the interpretation should be given equal importance. They believe that interpretive essays is offered against a background of ideas shared by the essayist and reader as to what constitute a persuasive argument. So whenever you are interpreting a text, whenever you are interpreting a text, or when you are interpreting a text, you call it as an interpretative essay. So an interpretive essay offers a background of shared ideas. Usually when you write an interpretive essay, it gives out a background of shared ideas. So whenever a author put forth an argument or put forth his interpretation, he often gives it along with a shared idea that he shares with the readers. So even the reader of a critical text might have a background knowledge on the text. So it is based on this background knowledge that he put forth his argument, and this argument should be persuasive, which means that whenever you are presenting a thesis, whenever you are presenting the project for that matter, you must focus on making it persuasive. You must make the reader believe in your argument. And how do you do that? You contextualize the text based on the shared assumptions. You contextualize, you try to take the text and place it in a context, the time period in which it was written, and you will try to substantiate that these and these factors made the play like this because it was written during this time period. Then the biographical detail of the author might be taken and say that since he went through these hardships, he might have written like this. So he must try to persuade the audience to win over them. So he must try to make the reader aware of his arguments. An interpretative essay will have to be coherent. It should be coherent in the sense that it should have a beginning, middle and an end. It should be plausible, that whatever that you speak through should be plausible. That is, it should be believable. Whatever that you say must be believable. And another thing is that it should be rhetorically effective. That is, when you read, you won't feel like this is just a cheap argument made by someone. It should be rhetorically effective. You should be choosing the right words to put forth your argument convincingly. You must be able to convince the audience that your argument holds true. And in order to convince the audience, you need to set it up against a context. Then you need to persuade the reader. The presentation of interpretation is also significant. The way in which you present your arguments is also significant. That's why we said that it should be coherent, it should be believable, and it should be rhetorically effective. That is, the choice of words should also be important. So the way in which you present is also significant. You cannot present it with grammar mistakes and spelling mistakes, etc. And you should not present it with no head and tail. That is, you should have a well structured essay. You cannot merely set down random expressions of feelings. That is, after reading a text, you cannot just write that I felt like this, or you should not be subjective when writing an interpretive essay. When you are writing a thesis, you should not be subjective, which means that your aspect or your point of view, when you read the work for the first time, what you felt, all these things does not matter at all, because whatever that you speak must be supported by some opinions. It should not be unsupported. That is, it should always be supported by opinions. That is why you find citations in writings. In research writings, you find citations because you need to cite certain authors. You need to review the literature. Who all wrote it earlier, wrote about this particular aspect or wrote about the particular theme earlier. You need to have a fair idea on the work that is written so far on a particular work. And then you need to support your arguments based on these earlier interpretations. So you must have supporting opinions. You cannot just express your subjective opinion about a text. You must have certain supporting evidences as well. The essayist must point to evidence that the reader will not only know what you believe, but also will understand why you believe it. So there must be some level of supporting audiences too. There must be some supporting evidences to support your argument too, so that the reader would believe you. And the reader would understand why, the reader would believe in you, and reader would understand why you believe in the argument. You must make yourself clear. Why are you putting forth this thesis? Or why are you putting forth this hypothesis? You need to make the reader believe in your argument by providing supporting evidences as well. Is that clear? So these are all characteristics of a good interpretation. That is, you cannot say that all interpretations are equally significant. A good interpretive essay is offered against a background of shared ideas that the reader as well as the writer has, and this will constitute his persuasive argument. That is, if both the reader and the writer have a shared idea about a text, it will be easy for him to communicate his idea with the reader. The second thing is that whatever that you write must be coherent, it must be believable, and it must be written in the right language. It must be written using the right words. Third is that, again, presentation of your argument is significant. You cannot randomly write about your own feelings. You must substantiate it with previous literature. You must substantiate with previous opinion. None of your opinion must go unsupported. It should be supported by previous critical writings made on the work. Then the essayist must point out to evidences that the reader will not only know what you believe in, but also understand why you believe it. So the reader must, or the writer must also put forth the evidences that he collected from the text. ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ ഇന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ കൊണ്ടാണ് ഞാൻ ഈ ഒരു ആസ്പെക്ട് ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്തുണ്ടെന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നത് എന്ന രീതിയിൽ ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ ക്രിട്ടിക്ക് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരും, ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ സൈറ്റ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരും. അതല്ലാതെ എക്സ്റ്റേണൽ സോഴ്സസിൽ നിന്നും സൈറ്റ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടി വരും. ഈ രണ്ട് സൈറ്റിങ്ങും, ടെക്സ്റ്റിൻ്റെ ഇൻ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് സൈറ്റേഷൻസും ഔട്ട്സൈഡ് സോഴ്സസിൽ നിന്നുള്ള സൈറ്റേഷൻസുമാണ് നിങ്ങളുടെ ആർഗ്യുമെൻറ്റിനെ കുറച്ചും കൂടെ ബിലീവബിൾ ആക്കുന്നത്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോൾ ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ ഇന്ന സ്ഥലങ്ങളിൽ ഇന്ന ഇൻസ്റ്റൻസസ് നടന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. സോ ഇറ്റ് സപ്പോർട്ട്സ് മൈ ആർഗ്യുമെൻറ്റ് ദാറ്റ് ദിസ് പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് വാസ് റിട്ടൺ വിത്ത് ദിസ് കീപ്പിംഗ് ദിസ് പെർസ്പെക്റ്റീവ് ഇൻ മൈൻഡ് എന്ന് നിങ്ങൾ പറയും. The second thing is that there was also a critical study based on this which was conducted earlier, and in that study too this particular argument was put forth in the parayabo. You will be able to support your essay, or you will be able to support your interpretation. I hope that it was clear. Now moving on, an essayist must face all the complexities of the work. He must be able to analyze all aspect of the work. He must not leave out any of the major aspects as well as the minor aspects. Some interpretations strike a reader as better than the others because they are more inclusive, that they account for more details of the work. So ചില ഇൻ്റർപ്രിട്ടേഷൻസ് വളരെയധികം നല്ലതാണ് ബിക്കോസ് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ഓൾ ഇൻക്ലൂസീവ്. ഇറ്റ് takes into account a whole lot of perspectives. It takes into account even the minute details. So it gives importance to the minor details. So some interpretations strike the readers as better than the others because they are more inclusive and they account for more details of the work. The less satisfactory interpretation leaves a reader pointing to some parts of the whole. ഇനി ചില ഇൻ്റർപ്രിട്ടേഷൻസിലാണെങ്കിൽ അവിടെ നിന്ന് ഇവിടെ നിന്ന് എടുത്ത് ഒന്നോ രണ്ടോ പോയിന്റ്സ് വെച്ചിട്ടായിരിക്കും എൻറ്റയർ എസ്സേ മുന്നോട്ട് പോകുന്നത്. ദറ്റ് ഈസ് the author might be focusing on one or two aspect of the work, and he might not be speaking about certain other aspects too which occur in the work, which makes it all the more difficult for the reader, because the reader might feel that certain parts were omitted or certain parts were avoided altogether. For example, if you were analyzing some text which was written during the times of Jane Austen, or when you are reading Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, you will come across certain silences in the text which nobody had ever talked about, but the later readers took up the task of trying to interpret these silences within the text. And if an author just wrote about the text superficially on all the other aspects of the work, they might not see these silences that are there within the text. And what happens is that they will leave out certain parts of the text and just focus on some minor parts. So you cannot say that all the novels written by Jane Austen are domestic comedies or domestic novels, because in some novels there are elements of slavery, there are elements of post-colonialism that a critic specializing in post-colonialism or subaltern studies would be able to unearth. For example, there is a particular session in Mansfield Park which speaks about slavery and speaks about colonization in India, and it is put in a negative light, and there is a silence around that kind of work that a particular person does in India. So the silence shows that that particular aspect of the work was never dealt with, but later on many critics took up this work and took up the task of looking at post-colonial interpretations of the text, where topics like slavery were hushed in these works. Especially in Jane Eyre too, there is an instance in which they towards the end, one of the characters go to India for missionary work, and what he does there is not given importance, and he says that they need to be reformed. But we Indians, I don't think that we, or for that matter any of the colonized nations, needed to be reformed, but their sole intentions was to go there and to reform people. So these are certain lacunas or silences that the earlier critics never studied about, but which the later critics did take upon the task of studying these texts in detail. So if you are not analyzing a literary work from all these perspectives, or you are just taking certain aspects of it and then studying, then you are not giving a full interpretation of the literary work. Okay, then you are leaving out a whole lot of aspects from the literary work. So it would come across as a less satisfactory interpretation if you leave out certain aspects of a work. However, a reader must not feel that a persuasive interpretation says the last word about a work, and a reader must not feel like a persuasive interpretation gives the last word about a particular work. That is, whatever that was written is the last word. That is, even the best interpretation is not the last word on a literary work. The work, if we value it highly, is richer than discussion. So because it was written first, right? So a work, if it is a highly valuable work, then it is more richer than the interpretation of it, or than the discussion of it. That is, you must never place the interpretation above the work. You must never place the interpretation above the work. You must always give importance to the work first and then to the interpretation. No matter how persuasive the interpretation might seem, it is just an interpretation, and you must always place the work well above the interpretation. That's what the author says. But again, for us to value an interpretation, we must find the interpretation plausible and inclusive. But then again, if you wish to value an interpretation, or if you wish to value the way in which a particular text was looked upon using a critical lens, then what gives validity to an interpretation is that it is plausible in one way or the other. This interpretation is believable, and it is inclusive. It takes into account all the aspects regarding a text. So the first thing that you need to do while interpreting a text is that you need to just go through the text multiple times, read it, reread it, try to find all the minute aspects that the text has covered, which was not taken up earlier, and then try to substantiate your viewpoint with external resources as well. So this would make it more believable, and it would be more inclusive. You will be looking at all the aspects of the text, so you won't be leaving out on anything. Now moving on to the conclusion. To sum up, interpretation often depends on making connections not only among various elements of the work, but also making connections on the works of other on the work and the other works of the author, and connection between a particular work and cultural context. So what you do in an interpretation is not just make connections among various elements of the work. For instance, if you take the characters of a story, and if you try to connect the characters of the story, that's one way of looking at the text. If you take for a novel, for that matter, if you look at the imageries, then you are looking at the various elements of the work which make it literature. You are looking at the form of the literary work. But another way of interpreting the text would be to analyze the text based on the other works written by the author. For example, when you are analyzing Hamlet, if you analyze Henry the Eighth, which was also written by Henry the Fourth, which was also written by Shakespeare, or Richard III, which was written by Shakespeare, or if you try to analyze the tragedies with the histories, then that would be another interpretation. And or if you try to make a connection between the works of William Wordsworth on childhood innocence, on the theme of childhood innocence in William Wordsworth's works, then you will be analyzing all the major poems of Wordsworth and trying to find elements of childhood innocence in it. Okay, so another way of looking at the work is looking at the cultural context in which it was written. As I said earlier, as I took the example of Hamlet, when I took Hamlet, I also chose the cultural context in which it was written. It was written at the time period in which Henry VIII got divorced, and he from Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's brother's wife. So the play had political implications as well. So here you are placing the work with the cultural context in which it is written. So either you can analyze a work by analyzing the individual elements, then you can analyze the work with other works written by the author, then you can analyze a work with the cultural context in which it is written. So a good interpretation would contain all these aspects within it. A good interpretation would often depend on all these aspects. It is a summing up of all these aspects which would make it a good interpretation. So I hope that the topic of interpretation was clear. If you have any doubts, you can ask me. Thank you.